The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet Montana landscape. The air had that crisp, late-summer edge to it, with a slight breeze carrying the earthy scent of pine and fresh-cut grass. It was the kind of afternoon that made you feel like time had slowed down, as if everything was just a little bit softer, more peaceful. I liked it that way. I was kneeling on the ground, my hands deep in the soil of the garden bed, pulling out weeds that had sprung up during the past week's rainfall. There was something satisfying about tending to the earth, watching things grow, and knowing that all my hard work would eventually pay off. My old gardening gloves were stained from the dirt, and my knees were sore from kneeling too long, but I didn't mind. I'd learned long ago to appreciate the simple things, things that didn't demand too much from you but gave back tenfold. I wiped my brow with the back of my hand, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. The birds were chirping in the trees, and I could hear the distant rush of the nearby creek. Everything felt normal, peaceful. "Ellie, you out here?" My husband Hank called from the back door, his voice carrying over the yard. "Yeah, just in the garden," I called back, not looking up from my work. He had a way of checking on me every so often, making sure I wasn't overdoing it. I had been tending to the garden for hours, but I wasn't in any rush. There was still so much to do. Hank didn't reply right away, and I could hear the creak of the door as it shut behind him. His footsteps on the gravel pathway grew louder as he walked closer. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. I looked up, at him, a half smile on my face. He always worried about me when I spent too much time outside, especially with the kind of wildlife that roamed the forests nearby. The last thing Hank needed was more stress. "I'm fine, just getting these weeds out," I said, picking up a particularly stubborn one. "I'll be in soon." "You want me to make dinner?" Hank stood there for a moment, looking out over the yard. "You sure?" His brow furrowed as he glanced at the trees at the edge of the property, where the forest began. "You've been out here a while. It's getting late." I waved my hand dismissively. "I'm fine, Hank. It's just a few more minutes. You know how I get when I start something." He didn't argue, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "All right, just don't be too long." I nodded, turning my attention back to the garden. I knew Hank was just being cautious, but it wasn't like anything was going to happen. We'd lived here in this secluded part of rural Montana for years, surrounded by miles of forest and wildlife. The occasional bear sighting was nothing new, and the rangers had assured us time and time again that the bears mostly kept to themselves. Still, I understood Hank's wariness. The wilderness here could be unpredictable. The sun was dipping lower, casting an orange glow over the yard as I continued to work. My hands moved automatically now, pulling out weeds, collecting dead leaves, and shaking the dirt from the roots. The rhythmic sound of the wind in the trees was like a lullaby, soothing and familiar. That's when I heard it. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves just moments, before suddenly stilled. The quiet was so sudden that it made my skin crawl. It was the kind of silence that came before something important, something dangerous. I paused, my heart rate quickening as I stood slowly, instinctively looking toward the tree line at the edge of our property. My breath caught in my chest as I saw the movement, slow at first, then faster as the shape came into view. It was massive, too large to be any kind of typical animal, a deep, earthy brown, the fur matted and thick, the muscles of its body rippling with each step. A grizzly bear. My stomach dropped as my mind raced to process what I was seeing. Bears weren't uncommon in these parts, but it was rare to see one this close. We lived on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest, but it wasn't typical for a bear to wander so near to the house. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The bear was moving steadily toward me, its large paws crunching on the dry leaves as it made its way across the yard. Its eyes locked on mine, and I felt a rush of terror flood through me. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, as if the sheer size of the animal had paralyzed me. I had read all the warnings. Make yourself appear large, don't run, don't approach. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I could do was watch as the bear continued its approach, its heavy breathing getting louder with each passing second, My first instinct was to run, to get inside, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, a prey animal caught in the gaze of a predator. The bear's eyes were wild, unblinking, its nostrils flaring as it drew closer. I could see the sharpness of its claws, the muscle rippling in its shoulders. Every step it took sent a shiver down my spine. "Ellie!" Hank's voice called, out from the back door. He must have noticed the bear, too. "Get inside now." I barely heard him over the pounding of my own heartbeat. My mind raced. I needed to move, needed to get inside, but my body refused to obey. Then the bear lunged. It happened so quickly. One moment it was walking toward me, and the next it was on top of me. The force of its impact knocked me off my feet, and I fell hard to the ground. A scream escaped my throat as the bear's claws raked across my thigh, tearing through flesh and muscle. Pain exploded in my leg, and I gasped for air, my body struggling to understand what was happening. In a panic, I shoved at the bear's massive form, but it barely seemed to notice. Its weight pinned me to the ground as it opened its mouth, its teeth bared in a snarl. I could see the saliva dripping from its maw, and the smell of blood, my blood, filled the air. The pain in my leg was unbearable, and for a moment I thought I might not make it. But then, just as quickly as it had attacked, the bear stepped back, as if deciding I wasn't worth the effort. It let out a low growl and turned, retreating into the trees. I lay there gasping, my heart still racing, unsure if I was alive or dreaming. I could hear my own breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, the sound so loud in my ears it almost drowned out the eerie silence that hung over the yard. The bear's heavy footsteps had faded into the distance, but my body refused to move. The blood from the deep gash on my thigh pooled beneath me, warm and sticky, and the pain radiated from the wound in sickening waves. I could still feel the bear's claws, sharp like knives, ripping through flesh. But I wasn't dead, I hadn't been killed. Somehow the terror that had rooted me to the spot was giving way to a different kind of fear, a fear that I might not make it inside in time, that I might bleed out before Hank could even reach me. I tried to push myself up from the dirt, my hands trembling as they made contact with the grass. I screamed out, but it was a weak sound, more of a whimper than anything. "Ellie, Ellie!" Hank's voice was urgent, frantic. He was running toward me now, his feet crunching on the gravel path as he crossed the yard. I could see his face twisted with concern, his eyes wide with panic. But I couldn't get up. The pain was too much. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to push through the dizziness that clouded my thoughts. If Hank didn't get to me soon, if I didn't get inside, God, I wasn't ready to die out here, not like this. "Ellie!" His voice was closer now, his shadow falling over me as he dropped to his knees beside me. His hands hovered over the wound on my leg, not sure where to start. I think it's bad, Hank," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I could feel the warm blood soaking through my jeans, but the words didn't seem to matter. What could I say? There was a bear in the yard, and I was barely holding it together. He didn't hesitate. "We're getting you inside, now." His hands were firm and gentle as he gripped my shoulders, helping me to my feet. My head spun, my leg almost giving out beneath me. I leaned heavily on Hank, my chest heaving with every breath. The house was only a few steps away, but it felt like miles. The world was narrowing down to just me, Hank, and the pain. Shit. "Ellie, what the hell happened? Where is it?" Hank's voice was filled with confusion and anger, his eyes darting around the yard like he expected the bear to come back at any moment. "I don't know," I said, my voice thin. It just appeared. I didn't see it coming. My stomach twisted at the memory of those eyes, the wild, unblinking stare. The way the bear had come at me like it had no choice but to attack. The thought of it sent a chill through my spine. "Stay with me, Ellie." Almost there. Hank's grip tightened, his body acting as a support as I limped along beside him. We reached the back door and Hank swung it open with one hand, pulling me inside with the other. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, my back against the cold tile. The house felt like a sanctuary, but the fear didn't fade. It clung to me like a second skin. I looked up at Hank, my vision blurry, the pain from my leg a constant sharp reminder of what had just happened. "I need a phone," I said urgently, my voice shaking. "I need to call." "Call 911. Hank, didn't waste a second. He was already on his feet, pulling the cordless phone from its charger on the counter. His face was tight with worry as he dialed the number, the sound of the tone ringing through the otherwise quiet house. I could barely hear it over the rushing in, my ears, the blood pounding in my head. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice cut through the chaos in my mind. Bear attack, Hank practically shouted into the phone, his voice frantic. My wife, she's been attacked by a grizzly. We're on the outskirts of town, near the old Thompson property. Please hurry. I could hear the operator's voice in the background asking questions, but all I could do was stare at the ceiling, trying to control my breathing, trying not to pass out from the pain. Ellie, stay with me, Hank said, kneeling beside me again. He was looking down at my leg, his hands hovering over the wound, unsure of what to do. Help is on the way. I'm going to try to stop the bleeding, okay? I barely nodded, the fog in my brain thickening as I struggled to stay conscious. My head felt like it was floating, and the sharp pain in my leg was all-consuming. The blood, the way it seemed to just keep flowing, made it hard to think clearly. I needed help. I needed it now. The sound of sirens in the distance was a small relief, but it felt so far away. Please, hurry, I whispered. Hank was still trying to keep pressure on my leg, his hands slick with my blood. They'll be here, Ellie. Just hang on, please, hang on. I could feel his hands shaking as they pressed against the wound, but it didn't stop the bleeding. The blood just kept coming, soaking through my pants and onto the floor. My breathing became more labored, each inhale a struggle. I felt cold, so cold, and the darkness was creeping in around the edges of my vision. The sirens grew louder, closer. I could hear the faint crunch of tires on gravel, the low hum of voices as people arrived. The door opened, and a group of paramedics rushed in. Hank moved aside as they took over, their movements swift, practiced. Get her on the stretcher, one of them barked. Let's move. My body felt like dead weight as they lifted me, and I let them. I couldn't fight it anymore. The pain was starting to dull, but everything else was still so sharp, so real. I heard Hank speaking to one of the paramedics, his words a blur, but I caught snippets, something about a bear, something about the forest. The paramedics worked quickly, securing me on the stretcher and moving me toward the door. The last thing I remembered before the world went dark was Hank's face, etched with fear and worry, his voice telling me everything would be okay. But I wasn't sure. Was it going to be okay? The attack had happened so fast, too fast, and I was left with nothing but blood on the floor and a deep wound in my leg. Nothing but the memory of a grizzly's eyes, wild and calculating, before it decided to retreat. Nothing but the feeling of its claws, sharp and unforgiving. And yet I had no idea if it would ever come back. The world around me spun as I lay on the stretcher, my body jerking with every bump of the gurney, as the paramedics wheeled me through the house and out the back door. The bright daylight stung my eyes, but I couldn't fully process the light anymore. My thoughts were too scattered, too jumbled. My mind kept flashing to the bear's savage attack, the way it had barreled into me, knocking the wind out of me as its claws sliced across my skin. I could still feel the hot, wet pain of the wound, as if the bear's claws were still embedded in my leg. I let out a shallow breath, trying to steady my racing heart. But the fear that gripped me, the terror that I might not survive this, was overwhelming. I could hear the distant hum of sirens in the background, but it felt like it was all happening far away, as though I was floating in some distant nightmare. The paramedics continued their hurried work, their voices a blur of words and instructions. I didn't recognize their faces, just shadows moving around me, working as they were trained to do. But the one thing that stood out was the cold, sharp stench of antiseptic that seemed to fill my lungs, mingling with the scent of sweat and blood. My own blood soaking through my clothes. Ellie, I need you to stay with me, okay? The voice came from one of the paramedics, a woman with short black hair and a stern expression. She was focused on the bandages she was wrapping around my leg, trying to stop the bleeding. Ellie, talk to me. How do you feel? I feel cold, I managed to say, my voice weak and thin. The coldness in my body wasn't just from the blood loss, it was from the fear, the kind of fear that seemed to paralyze your insides, the kind that made everything seem hazy and unreal. You're going into shock, the woman said. her voice low but controlled. "Stay with me. Keep talking. Focus on my voice." I tried to do as she asked, but the effort felt impossible. My mind was foggy, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a windstorm. I could barely concentrate on anything except the memory of the bear, the massive creature, the way it had come out of nowhere, how it had charged at me with such raw animal force. It had happened so quickly. One moment I was tending to my garden, the peacefulness of the afternoon wrapping around me like a blanket. The next moment, my life had been ripped apart by the sheer brutality of the attack. The bear's growl still echoed in my ears, deep and guttural, the way its claws had raked through my leg, leaving me helpless on the ground. "Ellie, focus," the paramedic continued, her voice snapping me back to the present. "Can you tell me what happened?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "A bear, a grizzly, it just came out of the trees. It attacked me." I could hear her making a sound in response, but it didn't register at first. It wasn't until we reached the ambulance that she spoke again. "Okay," she said. "We're almost there. I need you to keep your eyes open for me. You're going to be fine. We'll take care of you." I nodded, though I didn't believe it. How could I? My body felt like it was shutting down, and the images of the bear kept flashing in my mind. The look in its eyes, the cold, hungry stare that had fixed on me before it attacked. The way it had been so focused, so relentless, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I could feel my heart beating harder in my chest now, the panic creeping back in. The bear's charge had been so sudden, so violent, I hadn't had time to think. My instinct had been to run, to escape, but my body had frozen, caught between the fight or flight response. I had done neither. As we approached the ambulance, I heard the faint sound of Hank's voice from behind me. It was muffled by the distance, but I could hear the urgency, the desperation in his tone. Ellie, I'm right here." His voice was breaking, and it broke something in me too. The flood of emotions, guilt, fear, helplessness, crashed into me like a wave. I wanted to respond, to tell him I was okay, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt my body go limp again as they loaded me into the back of the ambulance, the doors slamming shut with a finality that made my stomach drop. The paramedic continued her work, cutting off my blood-soaked pants and replacing the bandages on my leg. I flinched as the cold air hit the exposed wound, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing ache that settled deep in my bones. "Don't close your eyes," she urged me again. "Stay with me, Ellie. We need to make sure you're stable before we get you to the hospital." I tried to nod, tried to keep my eyes open, but the darkness was calling to me. Every time I blinked, the world seemed to slip further away. "Stay with me," she repeated, her hands gently pressing on my shoulder as she checked my vitals. Ellie, are you listening?" I wanted to scream, to yell at myself, to fight the haze, to fight the panic threatening to swallow me whole. But my body was weak, and my mind wasn't much better. The sound of the sirens was the only thing I could focus on now. The way they howled into the night as the ambulance sped through the rural roads, taking me further from the house, further from Hank, further from the nightmare that had started in the backyard. "Ellie," the paramedic said again, her voice sharp now, "you need to stay awake. Tell me what happened. Tell me more about the bear." I tried to answer, but my voice was barely a whisper, and even that felt like too much effort. It came out of nowhere," I croaked. "I didn't see it until it was too late. It was huge. I couldn't move fast enough." The paramedic nodded as if she understood. "Okay, we're going to take care of you. The bear's gone, Ellie. You're safe now." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to believe her. But in my mind, the bear was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. It would never leave. It would never let me go. The sterile smell of the hospital room hit me as soon as the paramedics wheeled me inside. The cold, clinical environment only amplified the pounding ache in my leg, the throbbing sensation where the bear's claws had raked through my flesh. Despite the pain, the worst part was the gnawing feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that I was no longer in control of anything. The attack, the bear, the terror, it was all too much, and I had no idea if I'd ever truly escape it. The bright hospital lights were blinding against my closed eyelids, and I could feel my body growing weaker with every passing second. I wasn't sure how long I'd been in the ambulance, how long I had been fighting to keep my eyes open, but now I was lying on a cold, hard bed, surrounded by strangers who moved around me with a sense of urgency. "Ellie, stay with us," a voice said, sharp and clear, breaking through the haze in my mind. I opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh light. My vision was blurry, and it took me a moment to focus on the face above me. A nurse, her face set in an expression of controlled concern. "Ellie," she repeated, leaning over me, "we need to get you stabilized. I'm going to give you something for the pain." I barely registered what she was saying as she pushed the needle into my IV. The sudden rush of relief that followed was almost too much. My body relaxed just a little, though the panic still simmered under the surface. "Where's Hank?" I whispered, my throat dry. The nurse didn't answer right away, but I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. Then Hank's voice, frantic and worried, broke through. "I'm here, Ellie, I'm right here," he said, his voice tight. I turned my head just enough to see him standing beside me, his face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed from the worry that had been hanging over him. His hand reached out, gently brushing my hair away from my forehead. "Are you okay?" I croaked, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. I'm fine," Hank said quickly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He reached for my hand, squeezing it with more force than I expected. "But you're not Jesus, Ellie. What happened out there?" "What the hell was that thing?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, the memory of the attack flooded back in an instant. The bear, its enormous form charging at me, its claws sinking into my flesh with terrifying precision. The rush of pain, the confusion, and then the strange quiet after the attack, as the bear had backed away and disappeared into the woods. I had thought it was over, but now, lying here in the hospital bed, I realized that nothing had ended. I don't know," I said, my voice small and shaky. "It just came out of nowhere. I didn't even see it at first. It was so fast, Hank, I couldn't finish the sentence. The terror had already begun to take root again, and my chest tightened with the memory of the bear's eyes, cold and unblinking. I could still feel the weight of it on me, pressing down on my chest, holding me in place while the claws tore through my skin. Hank's hand tightened around mine, his thumb running along the back of my hand in a slow, soothing motion. He was trying to reassure me, trying to anchor me back to the present. But my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the yard, when the bear's growl had rumbled through the air, signaling the beginning of something I couldn't control. "Don't think about it," Hank said softly, his voice barely above. A whisper. He was trying to keep it together, but I could hear the strain in his words. "You're safe now. The bear's gone. You're going to be okay." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything would go back to normal, that the world would make sense again. But it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. The pain in my leg was sharp, but the fear was still there, still clinging to me like a second skin. The nurse came back into view, a clipboard in hand. She checked the IV and adjusted it, then looked over at Hank. "We're going to keep her under observation for a while," she said, her voice clinical. "There's a chance for infection with a wound like this, so we'll monitor her vitals. I've ordered some blood tests as well. But right now, we need to get her stabilized." Hank nodded, though I could see the worry still etched into his face. "What about the bear?" he asked, his voice tight. "Is it still out there? Can someone go?" "We'll alert the rangers," the nurse said, cutting him off gently. "But it's unlikely that the bear will come back. Grizzlies tend to avoid human settlements unless they're startled or hungry. It sounds like this was an isolated incident. Still, we'll report it." "Isolated incident?" Hank repeated, his voice sharp. "Ellie was attacked. How is that isolated? We need to do something." The nurse gave him a sympathetic look but didn't respond. Instead, she checked my wound again, nodding as she finished. "We'll take care of her. You can stay for now, but if you need anything, just let us know." With that, she left the room, leaving Hank and me in the quiet of the hospital. The steady beeping of the machines monitoring my vitals was the only sound now, filling the emptiness between us. Hank didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, his hand still resting on mine, and I could feel the weight of his concern pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the image of the bear from my mind. I tried to focus on Hank, on his presence beside me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the forest, the trees, the shadowy figures, and the monstrous shape that had emerged from them. "What if it comes back?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What if it comes back for me, Hank?" Hank shook his head slowly, his thumb brushing across my palm. "It won't," he said firmly, though his eyes flickered with doubt. "Bears don't just come back, Ellie. You're safe. We'll figure this out." But I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. And in that moment, I realized something even more terrifying. I wasn't just afraid of the bear. I was afraid of what had happened to me, of how it had shaken me to my core. "I don't feel safe, Hank," I said softly, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to feel safe anymore." Hank looked at me, his face softening with empathy. I know, Ellie, but we'll get through this. You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe him. But as the hours stretched on, the fear lingered in the back of my mind, and the hospital room seemed to grow smaller, closing in around me. The bear was gone, but its shadow still haunted me, lurking in the corners of my mind. And no matter what Hank said, I didn't know how to escape it. The hospital room was colder than I remembered when I woke up, the air thick with antiseptic, and the constant rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The pain in my leg had dulled slightly, but it still felt like someone had driven a hot poker into my flesh. The wound, a jagged reminder of the bear's claws, throbbed with each beat of my heart. I wasn't sure how long I'd been here. Hours, maybe days. My head felt foggy, as though I'd been floating in and out of sleep for too long. But what I did know was that I was still trapped in the memory of that attack, as vivid as if it had just happened. "Ellie?" Hank's voice broke through the haze, soft but urgent. His presence was a comfort, but I could tell he was holding something back. His eyes were tired, and the lines on his face were deeper than they had been before. I blinked, trying to focus on him. "Hank," I whispered, my voice hoarse from the dry air. "Is it over?" Hank's lips pressed into a thin line as he moved closer, sitting beside me. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet, but I could see the tension in his posture. "It's over. The doctors said you're stable now." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to make of it. Over? How could anything be over when the fear still gripped me so tightly? I could still feel the bear's claws digging into my leg, still hear its growl in the back of my mind. The bear had been a predator, a force of nature that had taken me by. Surprise and that feeling of vulnerability hadn't faded. "The rangers know," Hank continued, his voice softer now. "They're tracking the bear, but they haven't found it yet. They said it could have been a one-time thing. A one-time thing." My mind fought against that. How could that bear, that monster, just leave and never come back? It had charged me without warning, and the thought that it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, made the walls of the room feel like they were closing in on me. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. "What if it comes back, Hank?" I whispered. The thought of being alone, of being outside again without any protection, terrified me. "What if I—" "Ellie, listen to me," Hank interrupted gently, leaning closer to me. "I know you're scared, but you're safe now. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." I wanted to believe him, to trust that everything would go back to normal, but how could I? I had been so sure that I was safe in my own backyard, that nothing could touch me. And then the bear had shown up out of nowhere. How was I supposed to feel safe now? "I'm scared, Hank," I said, my voice breaking as I tried to hold back the flood of emotions that were threatening to spill over. "I don't feel safe anymore. I feel like I'm always waiting for it to come back, for something else to happen." Hank's hand found mine, and he squeezed it tightly, as if trying to ground me. "You're not alone, Ellie. You don't have to face this on your own. I'm here. We'll get through this together." I nodded, though the knot in my chest didn't loosen. It wasn't just the bear that scared me. It was the aftermath, the lingering sense of vulnerability that I couldn't shake. The thought that I could be attacked again at any moment, the constant uncertainty. It was eating away at me. The door to the room opened, and a nurse stepped in, her cheerful face a stark contrast to the heaviness that hung in the air between Hank and me. "How's she doing?" she asked, looking at me with a soft smile. "She's hanging in there," Hank said, his voice more measured now. "But she's still struggling with the attack. She's having a hard time processing everything." The nurse nodded sympathetically. That's perfectly normal, Ellie. Trauma like this takes time to heal, physically and emotionally. We've been monitoring you, and the wound is healing. Well, but I think you could benefit from talking to someone. A counselor, maybe. Just to help process what you've been through. I didn't respond right away. Talking to someone felt like it would make everything real, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it all yet. The bear, the attack, the fear, it was all too much. I wasn't sure how to put it into words. I didn't even know where to start. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, the nurse added, sensing my hesitation. But we'll be here when you're ready. She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. I'll give you some time. The doctor will be in soon to check on you again. But don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything. When she left, the room fell silent again. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor, marking the passage of time. I turned to Hank, my eyes filled with uncertainty. What if I never feel normal again? What if this never goes away? Hank's expression softened and he leaned closer to me, brushing a lock of hair away from my forehead. Ellie, it's going to take time. I can't tell you when you'll feel better, but I know you will. I know you're strong enough to get through this. You're one of the toughest people I know. I didn't feel tough. I didn't feel strong. I felt broken, raw, and exposed. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that someday the fear would fade. But for now, the only thing I felt was the scar on my leg, the painful reminder that I had been attacked, that something had reached into my life and torn it apart. I don't know if I can go back out there, I whispered. I don't know if I can ever feel safe in my own backyard again. Hank's hand found mine again and he squeezed it. You don't have to go back out there yet. We'll take it one step at a time, and when you're ready, we'll go out there together. We'll make sure you feel safe again. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the fear was still there, gnawing at me from the inside. The bear had come for me once, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it would come again. The woods, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed like a place of danger, a place where the rules of safety didn't apply. Hank seemed to sense my unease, and his grip on my hand tightened. We'll get through this, Ellie. We'll take it slow, but we'll get you back to where you were. I promise. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find a way to believe him, but all I could see were the bear's eyes, watching me from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't over. Not yet. But maybe, with time, I could learn to fight the fear. Maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim my life. But for now all I had was the promise of the future, and the steady sound of Hank's voice, reassuring me that we would face whatever came next, together. The days blurred together in the hospital. It felt as though time had become a distant concept slipping through my fingers. The pain in my leg had begun to fade, but the trauma from the attack hadn't loosened its grip on me. Each time I closed my eyes, the image of the grizzly's eyes, cold and calculating, flashed behind my eyelids. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside my hospital window felt like the bear was coming back for me. I was lying in my hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling, when Hank's voice broke through the monotony. It was quieter today, almost distant, as if he was trying to keep his own fears hidden from me. Ellie, we need to talk, he said, his voice hesitant. I turned to look at him, noting the way he stood just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets. He had that look again, like something was eating away at him. Hank wasn't one to show weakness, but lately I could see the cracks starting to form. I propped myself up on the bed, the IV tugging slightly at my arm as I moved. What's going on? I asked, my voice still hoarse from the days of barely speaking. Hank stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He looked down for a moment, like he was gathering his thoughts before sitting at the edge of the bed. I talked to the sheriff this morning, he said, his eyes meeting mine. They've been tracking the bear. They haven't found it. Yet no sign of it at all. I frowned, confusion knitting my brow. Is that a good thing? I mean, I don't understand. How is that possible? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not, Ellie. Something's off. I don't know what to think anymore. It's like the bear just vanished. They've sent out search parties, set up traps, and no one's seen any sign of it for days. Nothing. It's like it never existed. I stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what he was saying. I thought back to the attack, how real it had felt. The terror, the bear's weight pressing down on me, its claws tearing through my skin. "But it was real, Hank," I said, my voice tight. "It wasn't a dream. I know it wasn't a dream, Ellie." Hank interrupted, his voice sharper. "Now, I'm just telling you what they said. There's no trace of the bear. It's like it's just disappeared." I could feel the unease creeping back into my chest, that familiar knot tightening in my stomach. How is that even possible? The bear doesn't just vanish, it was huge. It attacked me. Why would it just disappear? Hank's eyes darkened, and he looked away for a moment. I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. "I don't know, Ellie. But that's not the only thing. The sheriff, he said there's been other reports. Strange ones. Bears acting erratically, some near other houses. They're starting to think it could be something more than just a bear." "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "They're talking about it like it's some kind of pattern," Hank said slowly, his voice tense. "Unusual behavior. Bears coming into residential areas, attacking people. It's happening more often than it should, and they don't know why." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This wasn't just about my attack anymore. It was something bigger, something that seemed to stretch beyond what we could see or understand. My chest tightened as a sinking feeling grew within me. "So, you're saying it's not just one bear? It could be more. Something's making them act like that," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. Hank nodded, his face grim. "That's what they think. The sheriff mentioned a few other incidents, but they haven't connected the dots. Yet, no one knows why the bears are acting this way." A sense of dread settled in my stomach, cold and deep. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the bear that had attacked me. It was the whole situation, the eerie feeling that something bigger was going on, something that no one was ready to explain. "I just want to go home," I muttered, staring down at my hands. My legs still ached, but it wasn't the physical pain that was tormenting me anymore. It was the fear, the unknown, the idea that this might happen again, or worse, that it wasn't. Just a random bear attack at all. Hank placed his hand on mine, his fingers warm against my skin. "We will, Ellie, I promise. We'll get you out of here soon. But I need you to trust me when I say that you're not alone in this. We'll face whatever comes together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel the safety in his words, but the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. The sheriff, the rangers, no one had answers. The bear had been real, but now with no trace left behind, it was like it had never existed. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a slow, steadying breath. "What if the bear comes back, Hank?" I whispered, the fear creeping into my voice despite my best efforts to hold it in. "What if it's not over? What if it wasn't just a random attack?" Hank squeezed my hand gently. "If it comes back, we'll handle it. We'll call the authorities and we'll get you out of harm's way. I won't let anything happen to you. You're safe now, Ellie." But even as he said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was lurking, just beneath the surface. The fear was there, growing with each passing day, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. I wanted to escape it, to return to a life where things made sense. But the reality was that everything had changed. The bear had been the catalyst, but now I was left wondering what else was out there hiding in the dark. "Okay," I said finally, my voice quiet. "I'll trust you, Hank. But I don't know if I can ever feel safe again. Not with what's going on. Not with this thing that's happening." Hank didn't respond right away. Instead, he just sat there, his hand still holding mine as we both tried to make sense of the mess we found ourselves in. The hospital room felt smaller, the walls closing in, and the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on my chest. "You don't have to understand it right now, Ellie," Hank said after a long pause, his voice soft. "You just have to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." I nodded, though the doubt still lingered, swirling in the back of my mind. The bear had been real, the terror had been real, and now there were whispers of something even darker, something more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. I had no way of knowing what the future held, but one thing was certain. I would never look at the forest the same way again. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow stripes of light across the sterile hospital room. I hadn't slept well the night before, not that I expected to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bear, its eyes locked on me, the sound of its growl echoing in my ears. Every noise seemed magnified, each creak of the floor, the murmur of voices in the hallway, the distant sounds of footsteps. I was waiting for something to happen, something I couldn't explain. It felt like a storm was coming, and I was stuck in the eye of it, powerless to do anything but wait. "Ellie?" Hank's voice called out softly from the doorway, pulling me from my thoughts. He had been coming and going, trying to take care of things outside the hospital while I rested, though I wasn't sure how much rest I was getting. Every hour seemed to drag on. I turned my head toward him, offering a weak smile. "Hey," I whispered, my voice still rough from the days of barely speaking. The wound on my leg was healing, but the pain hadn't completely gone away. It still felt like a dull throb, especially when I moved. "How are you feeling?" he asked, crossing the room and sitting beside my bed, his eyes filled with concern. I shrugged, trying to seem stronger than I felt. "I'm okay, I guess. The pain's not as bad, but it's the fear. That's still there." I looked down at my leg, remembering how it had felt when the bear's claws had ripped through my flesh. It wasn't just the physical wound that haunted me, it was the terror that had seized me in that moment. "I know," Hank said, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding me, but it didn't fully ease the cold dread that still gripped my chest. "But we're getting closer to answers, Ellie, I promise. The sheriff and the rangers are here. They're going to figure this out." I nodded, but the thought of the authorities showing up only brought more questions. What were they going to do? How could they explain what had happened? Hank had mentioned the sheriff several times in the past few days, but I had yet to meet him or hear anything definitive. The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, making it difficult to breathe. Just as I was about to speak, the door opened, and a man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a look of determination in his eyes. Behind him stood a younger woman, dressed in a ranger's uniform. She looked more serious than I had expected, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that said she knew exactly what I was going through. "Mrs. Thompson," the sheriff said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I'm Sheriff Daniels and this is Ranger Stevens. We've been briefed on your situation, and we need to ask you a few questions if you're feeling up to it." I nodded slowly, my throat tightening at the thought of reliving what had happened. Hank's hand on mine tightened as well, a silent show of support. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but we had no choice. If we were ever going to make sense of it all, this was the first step. "I understand," I said, my voice trembling just slightly. "I'll do what I can." Sheriff Daniels stepped closer, pulling up a chair. He sat down slowly, his eyes locking with mine, as if assessing whether I was ready. His gaze was steady, professional, but I could sense the weight of his concern beneath it. "Mrs. Thompson, we know this must be hard for you," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But we need your help to figure out exactly what happened. What you remember from that day." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I had to do this, for me, for Hank. "It happened so fast," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I was in the garden, just pulling weeds. I didn't hear anything at first, just the sounds of the wind in the trees and the birds chirping. Then I noticed the quiet, like everything just stopped. And then I saw it, the bear. It came out of the trees, fast. I didn't have time to run. It charged me." Sheriff Daniels nodded, taking notes as I spoke. "What did you do after that? How did you manage to get away?" I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing as the memory replayed in my mind. I tried to push it off me. I kicked it, but I stopped myself, unable to finish. The image of the bear towering over me, its claws sinking into my flesh, was too vivid. It was as if I could still feel the weight of it. Ranger Stevens spoke up, her voice calm but insistent. "We've heard reports of similar behavior from other animals in the area. Bears moving into residential spaces, acting aggressively without warning. Has there been any indication of this before?" I shook my head. "No, I mean, we've had bears around, sure, but they've always kept their distance. I never thought something like this would happen. It just doesn't make sense." Sheriff Daniels exchanged a look with Ranger Stevens, and I could see the concern in their eyes. They knew something I didn't, something that made my stomach churn with unease. "There's been an increase in bear activity across the region," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Not just bears either, other wildlife too. Something's changing in the environment, and we're trying to figure out what. But we need more information from you, Mrs. Thompson. If you can remember anything else, anything at all, it could help us." I closed my eyes again, trying to calm myself. It was so fast. It felt like it was waiting for me, like it knew what it was doing. I don't know why it attacked, but it did. It just attacked. Ranger Stevens leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "You're doing great, Ellie. Just keep telling us what you remember. We need every detail." I nodded, trying to push past the fear that was still gripping me. "After it attacked me, it just backed off. I thought it was going to finish the job, but it didn't. It just left, walked back into the forest like it didn't even care anymore." It didn't make sense. The sheriff looked at me thoughtfully, then at Ranger Stevens. "Could be it wasn't a typical bear attack," he murmured. "Could be something more, something we haven't figured out yet." I didn't know what they meant, but the look in their eyes made my skin crawl. It was as if they were aware of something I hadn't even considered, something beyond just an animal attack. My pulse quickened, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded as though that would somehow make it all less real. "We're going to keep you updated, Ellie," Sheriff Daniels said, standing up, "and we'll continue our investigation. In the meantime, we'll make sure you're safe. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." I watched them leave, the weight of their words pressing down on me. There was something unsettling in the way they looked at each other, the way they spoke. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew this wasn't over. The bear had come from somewhere, and it wasn't the only one. Something was out there, something that wasn't entirely natural. Hank took my hand again, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure this out, Ellie. I promise." But as I looked out the hospital window, the vast forest beyond felt more like a trap than a refuge, and I wasn't sure if we would ever be safe again. The steady hum of the hospital machines, the flickering overhead lights, and the quiet shuffle of nurses outside my room all seemed distant and surreal. I had lost track of time since I arrived. Was it 1 day? 2? I couldn't say for sure. What I did know was that the world outside these walls had shifted, as though everything that once felt certain was now a shadow, something just out of reach. "How are you feeling today?" The soft voice of Dr. Harris, my attending physician, broke through my thoughts. She stood at the foot of my bed, her expression kind but professional. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair, framed by soft features that seemed to read people better than they even realized. I could tell she was trying to gauge how I was holding up emotionally, just as much as physically. I smiled weakly, trying to muster some strength. "Better," I said, though the word felt hollow coming out of my mouth. "The pain is manageable. I guess it still stings, but I'm getting by." Dr. Harris nodded, checking the chart on the end of the bed and making a few notes. She had been kind throughout my stay, always explaining every step of the treatment. "That's good to hear. We've been able to clean the wound thoroughly, and there's no sign of infection yet, which is promising." I let out a slow breath, relieved but cautious. "What about the scars? Will I be okay?" Dr. Harris paused, meeting my gaze with an unreadable look. She had been gentle with her words all along, but now there was a shift. "The healing process will take time, but it's likely you'll have some scarring. The wound was deep, and it will leave a permanent mark. But as long as we continue with the right care, it shouldn't cause any further complications." I nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The thought of the scar, of wearing it on my skin as a permanent reminder of the bear's attack, unsettled me. I had expected it in some way. I knew that my body would carry the evidence of what happened, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. I shifted on the bed, trying to find a comfortable position. "What about physical therapy? Will I need it?" Dr. Harris smiled slightly, almost sympathetically. "Possibly. It will depend on how quickly your leg heals and how much strength you regain. There's some muscle damage, and that may affect your mobility for a while. But as long as the wound continues to heal as expected, we'll look at some rehab options for you in the next few weeks." "Good to know," I muttered, my mind drifting to the future, to the uncertainty of it all. I hadn't realized how much I had taken my mobility for granted until this happened. Now, I felt like a prisoner in my own body, waiting for it to heal, waiting for a sense of normalcy that might never come. Dr. Harris studied me for a moment, then stepped back. "I'll leave you to rest for a while. But Ellie, remember, it's not just your leg we need to worry about. The psychological recovery can take as much if not more time than the physical one." I nodded, though I didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to hear the truth from me, not yet. The emotional scars felt just as raw as the physical ones. Each time I closed my eyes, I could still see the bear. The way it had looked at me, the terror that surged through me as it lunged. After Dr. Harris left, I lay back in bed staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper from the nurse's station. I felt like I was suspended in time, waiting for something to shift, but unsure of what that would even look like. The pain in my leg had become a dull throb, something I could manage, but the pain in my chest, the fear, was a different matter. The door opened softly, and Hank stepped inside, looking a little more worn than usual. His eyes were tired, and his shirt was wrinkled, as though he'd been on his feet for longer than he'd realized. But the moment he saw me, his face softened, and his steps quickened. He'd been coming by every day, making sure I wasn't alone for too long. His concern was always there, lingering just beneath the surface. I didn't know how to feel about that. "How are you holding up?" Hank asked, pulling a chair beside the bed and sitting down. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. I could tell he was trying to keep his tone light, to act as if everything was normal. I sighed, glancing at the small bandage on my leg. "It's getting better, but it's still a lot. The pain is manageable, but there's this constant reminder that it happened. I can't stop thinking about it, Hank, about the bear." Hank's face tightened slightly, but he quickly masked it, putting on a reassuring smile. "You're going to be okay, Ellie. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but this is just one part of your story. We'll get through it, I promise." "Will we, though?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "What if I can't move on from this? What if I can't go back out there? What if the bear comes back?" Hank looked at me with such deep concern, I could see the weight of it in his eyes. "We'll deal with it when the time comes. Right now, we focus on you. Just get better. That's all we need to worry about." But I could see the hesitation in his face, too. He didn't know what to do with the fear that had taken root in me either. He couldn't see the endless loop of that bear's eyes, the sensation of its claws raking across my leg. He didn't understand what it felt like to be hunted, to be helpless in the face of something you couldn't control. "I'm scared, Hank," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to hold it together. "I don't know how to stop being scared. I can't shake it. It's like it's always with me." Hank squeezed my hand, his voice low and steady. "I know, Ellie, I know, but we're going to take it one day at a time. We'll get through this together. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to go through this alone." I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hand anchor me, but the fear didn't go away. Not yet. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that I would be okay. But I didn't know how to make the fear stop. I didn't know how to forget the feeling of the bear's breath on my skin, the sound of its growl reverberating through my bones. "We'll figure it out, Ellie," Hank said, his voice a little more firm now, as though trying to convince himself as much as me. "One step at a time." I nodded slowly, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with me. But as I closed my eyes, the fear lingered, a shadow I couldn't escape. And I knew no matter how much time passed, it would be a long while before I could ever feel truly safe again. The air in the hospital room was stale, the window slightly cracked to let in the faint breeze that couldn't quite cut through the heaviness in the room. I hadn't left the room for what felt like days. The pain in my leg had decreased to a manageable throb, but the emotional toll of the bear attack still sat heavily in my chest. I had yet to fully process what had happened. The way the bear had appeared out of nowhere, its massive form filling my vision. The terror of feeling completely powerless. I couldn't shake the image of those unblinking eyes, the growl vibrating through my bones. "Ellie?" Hank's voice broke through my thoughts, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and fatigue. "You doing okay today?" "Just trying to keep busy," I replied, my voice sounding hollow. I had no desire to do anything but lie there, replaying the events of the attack over and over in my head. "I just can't stop thinking about it, Hank." He moved to my side, placing a tray of food on the bedside table, though I wasn't sure I could eat. "I get it, but you need to eat. The doctors said you need your strength." I looked at the food, barely registering what it was, some kind of bland hospital meal, before glancing up at him. "I don't think I'm hungry," Hank sighed, sitting down beside me. "I get it, Ellie, but you've got to take care of yourself, for me, for us." I smiled faintly at his persistence, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my stomach, the sense that something was wrong, something bigger than just the bear. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door and a young nurse peeked inside. "Sorry to interrupt, but you've got some visitors, Ellie. A few reporters are here asking about the attack." I stiffened at the mention of the reporters, a cold pit forming in my stomach. I hadn't been ready for that. I had hoped the story would just fade away, that it would remain a random, unexplainable event that no one would really care about. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be the case. People loved a good story, and this one had all the right elements: a bear attack, a survivor, and a place as remote as this. I looked at Hank, my unease written across my face. "I'm not ready for this, Hank. I don't want to talk about it." He nodded, his own discomfort clear. "I'll handle it. Don't worry about anything, Ellie." The nurse smiled, though there was a hint of sympathy in her expression. "They won't take up too much of your time, just a few questions." I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the anxiety, as Hank stood and followed the nurse out into the hallway. I could hear their voices muffled, but it didn't matter. The reality of the situation was settling in. The bear attack was no longer just something that happened to me. It was now part of a story, a spectacle that would likely be picked apart by strangers. People from outside this small town, people who didn't understand what it was like to feel that primal terror, would now have their say. The door opened a few moments later, and Hank returned, followed by a man and a woman in their 30s, both holding microphones and notepads. They were dressed in professional attire, the woman wearing a bright blazer and the man sporting a suit, both of them looking as though they had done this 1,000 times before. "Mrs. Thompson," the woman began, her voice chipper but with an undertone of professionalism. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. We're just here to gather some information on the attack and how you're recovering. We know it's been a difficult time, but we'd really appreciate your perspective on what happened." I gave Hank a quick glance, but he was standing off to the side, his arms crossed, looking more uncomfortable than ever. I turned back to the reporters, my chest tight. "I'm not sure what I can tell you," I said quietly. "It all happened so fast. I didn't even see it coming." The man with the microphone nodded, his expression sympathetic but clearly eager for details. "Of course, we understand this is difficult, but people are very interested in your story. The local news has already picked it up, and we want to ensure we get your account of things. Can you walk us through what happened?" I took a slow, steadying breath. What could I say? Could I even tell them what I felt, what I saw? The words felt like they were caught in my throat, the fear of the attack still too fresh, too sharp. I glanced at Hank again, but this time he gave me an encouraging nod. "It's okay, Ellie," he said quietly, as though trying to reassure me. "Just tell them what you remember." I nodded, closing my eyes for a moment. "I was in the garden just pulling weeds," I began, my voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. Everything was quiet at first, the way it usually is. I didn't hear anything unusual until it was too late. Then I noticed the silence, the birds stopped chirping, and the wind, it just stopped. And then I saw it, a bear, a big one. It came out of the trees, and before I could even move, before I could even react, it was on me. The reporters were scribbling notes, their eyes focused on me as I spoke. The woman glanced at the man, and they exchanged a brief look before she asked, "What happened next? Were you able to defend yourself?" I swallowed, my throat dry. I tried. I kicked at it, tried to push it off me, but it was too strong. It knocked me to the ground, and its claws— I paused, unable to get the image out of my mind. Its claws dug into my leg. I thought I wasn't going to make it. But then Just as quickly as it had attacked, it backed off. It turned and left. Like it lost interest, I don't know why, it just disappeared into the trees. The man leaned forward, his voice almost conspiratorial. That's interesting. So it didn't try to finish the attack. I shook my head, still trying to process the events. No, it just left. I don't know why, but it's not something you can explain. The woman glanced at her colleague, then back at me. And how are you doing now? How's the recovery? I shifted uncomfortably. Physically, I'm healing. The doctors say I'll be okay, but emotionally, it's been hard. I don't know how to feel safe anymore. I can't even look at the woods without thinking. It might come back. It's not just the injury, it's the fear that stays with you. The reporters exchanged another glance before the woman spoke again. Thank you for sharing that. It's a lot to process, I'm sure. We'll be sure to share your story with the community. With that, the interview ended, and the reporters gathered their things, thanked me, and left the room. I felt drained, as though every ounce of energy had been siphoned away by their questions. Hank stayed close, his presence a steadying force, but even he seemed unsettled by the interaction. Well, that was something, he muttered, sitting back down beside me. You did great, Ellie. I managed a small smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. Did I? It felt surreal. Hank squeezed my hand. You're strong. But you don't have to keep doing this if you don't want to. If you need a break, just say the word. I nodded, thankful for his understanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The reporters were only the first wave. The local news would be followed by a wider audience. Everyone would want to know more, to dissect the event from every angle. And then there would be the people who didn't understand, the ones who would doubt me, dismiss the experience, and chalk it up to some bizarre coincidence. The bear had attacked me, and now it seemed I was the one who was being attacked, by the weight of the world's gaze, and as much as I wanted to push it all away, I knew I couldn't escape it. The hospital room had grown quieter with each passing day. A steady rhythm of nurses and doctors coming and going, their faces polite but distant. Time had a way of moving differently here. Slow, dragging, with the occasional burst of activity, and then nothing but the same white walls, the same sterile smell. I had grown accustomed to the routine, but something inside me refused to let go of the memory. It clung to me like a shadow, persistent and suffocating. I sat up in bed, my leg propped up on a pillow, the bandages now clean and well-maintained. The wound was healing, but every time I moved I could feel the tightness of the scar tissue, a constant reminder of what had happened. I had become too familiar with the weight of that memory. I didn't need to see the bear again, or even hear its growl to know it was still there. The fear was buried deep within me, a fear I couldn't escape no matter how many days passed. Hank had been incredible through it all, persistent, supportive, and always there when I needed him. He never once wavered, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the worry, the way he watched me like I might disappear if he turned his back for too long. He had promised me that everything would return to normal, but how could that be possible? How could anything ever feel normal again when the bear had shattered my perception of safety? He walked into the room, carrying a coffee cup and a small bouquet of flowers. His tired eyes softened when he saw me sitting up, but there was still that unease hanging over him, that look like he didn't quite know how to help me anymore. I could tell it was wearing on him, this constant tension between being the supportive husband and being the one who had to watch the person he loved fall apart. "Morning," he said, setting the flowers on the windowsill and handing me the coffee. "How are you feeling today?" I accepted the cup with a small nod. "Same as yesterday, I guess. Some pain, mostly just tired." Hank sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I know. This is hard, Ellie, but you're getting stronger every day. The doctors said the healing is going well and soon you'll be able to get up and move around more. We'll get through this." I glanced at him, studying his face for a moment. "Do you really think that, Hank?" I asked, my voice quiet. "That everything will be okay?" His gaze softened, and he took my hand gently in his. "I do. Ellie, I know it's hard to see right now, but this will pass. The fear, the memories, they won't last forever. We'll take it one step at a time." I squeezed his hand, but inside, a wave of doubt washed over me. Could I ever feel safe? Again? Could I ever walk through the woods or sit in my garden without wondering if the bear would come back? I couldn't push the feeling of dread away, no matter how hard I tried. The attack had stolen something from me that I wasn't sure I could ever get back. The door opened again, this time with a soft knock, and a nurse entered with a clipboard. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her tone warm but professional. "I just came by to check on you. How's the pain today? Have you been able to move around at all?" I put the coffee cup down and nodded. "It's manageable. I've been stretching my leg a bit, but mostly I'm just sitting here. I'm not sure I'm ready to try walking yet." The nurse smiled and made a note on her clipboard. "That's understandable. We want you to take it slow, but it's good to hear that you're able to move a little. The scar will take time to heal, but with the physical therapy exercises you'll regain strength. Just make sure you follow the doctor's orders." I nodded again, though the thought of therapy filled me with apprehension. Could I ever return to what I was before the bear attack, before I became a statistic, a headline in the local news? A survivor. The nurse handed me a small packet. "We also have some information for you about counseling services. The hospital recommends that all patients who experience trauma like this speak with someone. It's perfectly normal to need help processing everything." Hank shifted in, his chair glancing between the nurse and me. He had been supportive in every other way, but this, talking to someone, was something we had both been avoiding. I could tell he didn't want to push me into anything, but at the same time he was worried. "Thank you," I said quietly, glancing at the pamphlet. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet." The nurse gave me an understanding smile. "That's okay, but it's here when you're ready, and we'll be here too to help you with whatever you need." She left the room and I was left with Hank again, the weight of the silence between us heavy. I could feel the concern in the way he watched me, the way his eyes never fully left mine, like he was afraid to let me go. "I don't know, Hank," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I can go back to normal. I don't even know what that means anymore." Hank stood up and moved to sit beside me on the bed, his hand resting on my shoulder. "We don't have to figure it all out right now, Ellie. We'll take it one day at a time, okay? You don't have to force anything. We'll heal together." I nodded, but deep down I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just about the wound on my leg. It wasn't just the scar that would remain. The trauma had seeped into my soul, a quiet, relentless presence that followed me wherever I went. I couldn't forget what had happened, couldn't erase the feeling of helplessness. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in the hospital bed, staring out the window at the trees beyond. The world outside seemed so distant now, like something I could never quite touch again. I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching and looked up to see Hank standing in the doorway. He had been on the phone for the last half hour, and there was a sense of urgency in his movements now. "Ellie," he said, his voice tense, "I just got off the phone with the sheriff. They found something. They found tracks, bear tracks, near the woods behind the property. They think it's the same bear." My heart skipped a beat. It felt like the ground beneath me was shifting again, like the walls were closing in. The bear hadn't disappeared, after all. It was still out there. I didn't know what to say. The fear was back, that cold, familiar feeling that had clung to me since the attack. My throat tightened, and I couldn't find the words. "They're going to try to track it." "Down," Hank continued, sitting beside me again. "But Ellie, I want you to know something. They're not going to let this go. They're doing everything they can to make sure no one else gets hurt." I didn't reply, my mind racing. The bear hadn't left. It wasn't gone. The terror I had felt in my own backyard was still out there, just as real as it had been that day. How was I supposed to move on to heal when the thing that had shattered my sense of safety was still lurking in the shadows? Hank's hand squeezed mine. "We'll get through this. It's just one more hurdle, but you're not alone, Ellie. Not now, not ever." I wanted to believe him. I had to. But the fear in my chest made it hard to breathe, made it hard to see any way forward. The bear hadn't just changed my body, it had changed everything.